Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a nice weekend. So I just want to clarify, we do not have class on Friday. I totally forgot about that when I sent out that initial email. Um, so I sent a follow-up email reminding everybody that we do not have class on Friday since you guys were gifted that one day is spring break. So what we're going to do is we're going to have lecture today and on Wednesday. And instead of taking your quiz on Friday, you will be taking it on Wednesday. So you will have from Wednesday until Thursday to take the quiz instead of Friday to Saturday. So what that means for Jeopardy is we'll have to, on Wednesday, we'll check who's playing Jeopardy. But whoever's playing Jeopardy will not play until the following Monday. So I just recommend that they kind of look their notes over because it will have been some time since we had covered this material. So just to recap, no class on Friday. We will have lecture Monday and Wednesday. You'll take your quiz on Wednesday, and then we will be back the following Monday. That should be no problem. This week we have kind of a short lecture, so we should be able to cover that Monday and Wednesday, no problem. Any questions about that? No questions? All right, let me share my screen and we will get started. Oh, before we do that, all the exams are graded. It's the window for you to correct them is open until the 14th at midnight. So if I sent out, I believe, 2 detailed emails about specifically how you do that. So if you're having problems with that, please let me know. So far, I haven't received any emails from students, having trouble finding how to do that. Basically, you just navigate into the exam through Canvas. Do not go through Respondus for this. And there's a comment box on the right side of the screen, and you're just going to type your corrections in there. I don't need the full question. The question number is sufficient. And I also don't need the full answer for the multiple choice. If you just want to give me the question number and then the correct answer in terms of like A, B, C, or D, that works for me. Please don't attach a document. Please type directly into the chat box or the comment box. And for the essay question, each of you got a comment under your essay question explaining what was missing. All you need to do is include what was missing. You don't need to rewrite the entire essay question. We don't need all that. If you can just, fill in what was missing. If you got a 10 out of 10 on your essay question, you don't need to make any corrections. If you got a 0 out of 10, there may not have been any comments because that means you either didn't answer the question or the whole thing was wrong. So if you got a 0 out of 10, just start from scratch. So the purpose of the corrections is threefold. One, I want to give you guys the opportunity to earn some extra points. Two, I want to force you to learn the information. But 3, this is going to help you with your final exam. You can see the types of questions I like to ask, and by correcting it, you will see where in the notes and in the lectures I'm pulling this stuff from. It should also help you in your note taking going forward. If you are looking in your notes and you cannot find the answer, that means you need to be taking better notes. For the most part, in the essay questions, I tell you which lecture you need to look through. So if you're looking through your notes for that lecture and you're not seeing the answers, then that means you need to be taking better notes. If you are not taking notes at all, that might be a key as to why you didn't do super well in the exam. Like I explained in the syllabus and the first weeks of class, this is not a class that you cannot take notes. I provide the lecture to key you into when you take notes. So for instance, the importation and the deprivation model. It's literally just 2 terms on the lecture slide that I then talk about for 10 minutes. That's when you need to be taking notes. So use the lectures as a guide as to when you need to write something down. If there's just a term and I'm explaining that term, or explaining the phenomenon or explaining the research, that's what you need to be writing down. If you miss something, just pop your mic on and tell me to go back. I'm happy to explain it to you again. You can also schedule a meeting with me after class or shoot me an email and say, hey, I didn't understand what that meant. I can either meet with you over Zoom or I can just reply to the email and clarify something that you don't understand. So if you miss something, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm happy to explain it to you. Once you correct your exams, you will get 5 raw points. If you miss a few things here and there on your corrections, I'm still going to give you your 5 points. If the majority of what you write in your corrections is incorrect, or you are systematically not addressing all the things I asked you to address in your comment, in my comment, I'm not going to give you the 5 points, and I'm not going to reach out to you. You guys are adults. You have all the resources that you need to be able to do this. I'm going to look through it. If it is not sufficient, if you haven't gotten, at least 70% of the corrections correct, you're not going to get your 5 points. If you have questions about whether or not something is sufficient, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer. But like I said, you guys can use the notes, the lectures, your book, not your book, all the readings. This should not be hard for you. It is completely open book to correct your exams, and you have until midnight on Sunday to do so. So you have plenty of time to do this. Any questions about that? Unfortunately, we can't do this for the final. I wish that we could. They just don't give me enough turnaround time to grade the exams and to submit the final grades. Sorry, I really wish I could do it for the final, but please take this corrections opportunity as a way to sort of understand what the final is going to look like and the types of questions I ask, as well as where I pull those questions from. All right, if there are no questions about that, we'll go ahead and start the lecture. All right, so this week we are talking about intermediate sanctions. So intermediate sanctions are sometimes called alternative sanctions, sometimes they're called community corrections, but all of them are basically there to describe some sort of sanction that falls somewhere between routine probation and prison. So prior to the 1980s, when overcrowding really became apparent as a problem, there were few sentencing options for punishing offenders. Pretty much it was probation or prison. But the problem was that the range of the severity of crimes that are out there don't fall neatly into those two categories. So for many offenders, prison was too severe, whereas probation was too lenient. So to remedy this situation, many states began to develop alternatives. They were labeled as intermediate sanctions, community corrections, alternative sanctions, etc. But they were all designed to be punishment somewhere between prison and routine probation with respect to harshness and restrictiveness. So numerous sanctions were developed, including house arrest, electronic monitoring, intensive supervision programs, boot camps, day reporting centers. Let me explain what a few of those are briefly, and then we'll go into more detail as we move through the lecture. So house arrest is exactly what it sounds like. It basically means you're confined to your house. One thing you're going to probably get really tired of hearing me say is that all of these things vary by state, and they really do. So some states have several levels of house arrest depending on the severity of the crime that you committed, as well as your criminal history. So they might have the most severe house arrest, which means you can't leave your house at all. They might have a more lenient house arrest, which allows you to leave for work and church and doctor's appointments. Basically, you sort of prearrange that with your officer to let them know, these are the times that I need to leave. During your first meeting, if they let you know that you're on one of these sort of more lenient house arrests, you can tell them your schedule, and when you're supposed to be home, you can work that out. Or the most lenient house arrest basically just might be, you have to be in your home between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. So it really depends on the state. They might have 4 levels of house arrest, one where you can just leave for work and you need special permission for anything else. It really depends on the state. And also it depends on the state as to who is eligible for which type of these house arrests. House arrest is often known as home confinement as well. So if you hear that term, it's the same thing. So electronic monitoring is not the same thing as house arrest. Electronic monitoring can be used with house arrest, or it can be used on its own. Electronic monitoring just means you have an ankle monitor on that is transmitting a signal to some sort of probation or parole officer 24/7. And you can program it to let that officer know if you go near a no-no zone or if you leave your house. So if you are using electronic monitoring with house arrest, what it will be programmed to do is let that officer know when you leave the house. And if it's one of those more lenient house arrests, it will only be or ping the parole officer or probation officer if you leave when a time that you're not scheduled to be leaving. You can also use electronic monitoring not on house arrest. So this can be used for things like domestic violence abusers who have a no contact order with their victim or their spouse, and you can program it to ping the officer if you go near this person's home or place of work or the kids, daycare or school, if those are part of the no contact order. We also see this commonly used with sex offenders. So you can keep it so that it will ping the sex offender or ping the officer if the sex offender goes near like a school or a daycare, bus stop, YMCA, all the places, the no zones. So electronic monitoring can be a standalone device. It can also be used with house arrest. Other more recent forms of electronic monitoring are ankle monitors that ping an officer if you start drinking alcohol. This can be used for substance abusers or those that are addicted to alcohol or people that have been convicted of multiple DUIs. Basically, the way that it works is there's a part of the monitor which is like a receptor that goes flat against your ankle. And even though you don't feel it, you are always sweating, and it's testing the amount of alcohol in that sweat. So it has to hit a certain threshold, like, there's like a small amount of alcohol in mouthwash. So like, it's not going to flag the officer if you, take a swig of mouthwash. And I think you can even drink like a half a beer or so before it hits that threshold. But I think if you take like, a shot of whiskey or a shot of tequila, like boom, it dings it right away. So there's all these different types of electronic monitors that can be used, again, with house arrest or standalone as their own alternative sanction. So we also have ISPs. So the P can stand for probation or parole. It's just intensive supervision probation or intensive supervision parole. And that's exactly what it sounds like. So we have routine probation and we have routine parole. ISPs are basically more intense. So you have more conditions to follow. You have more things to do. You have maybe more drug tests or more frequent drug tests. You have to meet with your officer more often. And again, depending on the state, there are usually several levels of ISPs. So the more lenient ISPs, which are still more severe than routine probation, all the way up to, like, I believe the most severe ISP is like a sex offender one that usually requires electronic monitoring and even more conditions than the most severe intensive supervision, probation, or parole. It can be used for people on parole coming out of prison if they're high risk recidivists or high risk, somebody that's committed a fairly heinous crime but were given parole, or it can be used in the front end as probation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the research for ISPs and specifically how they're used, but generally that's what it is. It's intensive supervision, probation, or parole, and it's just more intense, more scrutiny than routine probation or parole. So a boot camp, you guys are probably very familiar with this. This can be done for adults. It can be done for juveniles. It can be in an incarcerated setting, or it can be in a community setting. It's basically sort of like prison, but with strict military discipline. Usually there's, required regimented workouts, required, classroom learning situations. If it's offered in the community, it would be, like Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, 8 to 5, something like that. Or it can be in an incarcerated setting as well, where they live there. These are not nearly as common anymore as they were in the 80s and the 90s. There are still a few around, but most of them are for juveniles, but we don't see them with the frequency like we saw them, in the 1980s and the 90s. Doris Layton McKenzie, who wrote the first couple of chapters that you had to read, did a lot of research on boot camps, and that strict military style discipline, the sort of screaming in your face, didn't really work well for juvenile delinquents, especially people that had experienced trauma. So a lot of them fell out of favor for that reason. So day reporting centers, basically this means, and this varies widely by the state and by the jurisdiction, but basically this means that you go to jail Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, or you go to jail for the weekends. This is for a more low risk offender. We see this with people that have gotten, multiple DUIs, stuff like that. But what we don't want to do is they haven't committed a crime so heinous that they need to spend, 2 to 3 years in prison. What we want to do is still give them the severity of being incarcerated, but not at the expense of losing their job, which we know is a correlate of committing more crimes. So this is used for somebody that has a good job. Or maybe does a lot of childcare for their kids. We don't want to expose the kids to all the problems that we discussed a few weeks ago when a parent is incarcerated.
What was this again? It was when they go to like pretty much jail on the weekends, so like part timers kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So they'll work with your work schedule. It might be like Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, if you're like a bartender or something that works at night. So it really just works with your schedule. I actually had a friend who got in trouble in high school and had to go to jail on the weekends. He got in trouble with drugs, and this was his like fourth or fifth time getting in trouble with drugs. He's now a DJ in London with a purple mohawk. I digress. Anyways, he had to go to jail on the weekends as a juvenile delinquent. It really varies. It's just one possibility, but we see this again. All of these alternative sanctions, the way that they are implemented, the way that they are structured varies widely. Who is eligible for them? We're going to talk about that in a minute. That's actually one of the problems of trying to evaluate them is the wide differences. So the goal here for all of these intermediate or alternative sanctions is instead of ordinary probation, these more severe sentencing options were expected to increase the cost of crime and thereby reduce criminal activity. All right, so there are three purposes of intermediate sanction. The first one is to provide what we refer to as graduated punishments or graduated sanctions. So a graduated sanction or a graduated punishment is one in which the severity of the crime can be tailored to the severity of the offense. So if we have someone that has maybe failed probation multiple times, and the third time they're in front of the judge, they've committed a more serious crime, we might give them intensive supervision probation. We can graduate up the sanction to match the severity of the offense. If we have two offenders, one of them that committed a burglary and the other that went on a string of burglaries, we might give one of them house arrest and the other one house arrest plus electronic monitoring. So it allows you to sort of combine the punishments together or to graduate the sanctions up or down to make it more severe or less severe so that it's easier to tailor the severity of the crime that they committed with the severity of the punishment. So that's what a graduated punishment or a graduated sanction is, that these punishments allow us to graduate up the severity or graduate it down so that it matches the crime. So the other purpose is that it's really easy to tailor them to the offender. So depending on these offenders, correlates of crime. So for instance, if we have an offender that is a drug offender and another offender that has a mental illness, and maybe they're both on intensive supervision probation, the drug offender, we can make some of their requirements go to drug treatment, and the mentally ill offender, we can make their requirements be to seek mental health therapy. You might even have a judge that talks to one of the offenders and he says, why do you keep committing these burglaries? And he's like, I can't get a job anywhere because I never finished high school. The judge might say, great, well, you know what? We're going to have one of your requirements to be get a GED while you're on probation. And that can be, so if you're not actively seeking your GED, that becomes a technical violation. So basically, we can use the power of the criminal justice system to tailor these punishments to allow for some rehabilitation to solve some of these crimes that result in the revolving door of justice, right? So if we never solve someone's drug addiction, they're going to keep committing crimes to support their habit and just cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. Or, if they grew up in a bad neighborhood and never got an education, never had a role model, we can use the power of the criminal justice system to get them some education, maybe some vocational training to better their lives. And the last purpose is one that we always have. We're trying to reduce the jail and prison populations and the associated costs. So generally speaking, even the most intensive supervision probation program or parole program is less than $2,000 per offender per year. To put someone in a jail cell is between $40,000 to $60,000 per offender per year. So it is much cheaper to watch this person more closely in the community than to incarcerate them. If you think about it, if they're in the community, they're paying for their own housing, they're paying for their own food, they're paying for their own welfare, healthcare, even, all sorts of things, transportation. When you incarcerate them, you incur all of those costs. So it is always, always, always cheaper to keep someone in the community than it is to incarcerate them. Even the most intensive supervision, parole, probation with electronic monitoring is still going to be way cheaper than incarcerating this person or keeping them in an incarcerated setting.
Andrew, I have a question. Did you see that the intermediate sanctions vary by like state?
Yeah.
So like each state has different types?
Yeah. Even within the states, jurisdictions are different. So our intermediate sanctions look different than Columbia versus, Greenville, which makes it super duper hard to look at the average effect of these treatments across our nation or even within the state, So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the next slide or the slide after that. So this last purpose, the reducing the jail and the prison and the associated costs, there's a little asterisk to that in the front end, because if these people fail whatever community sanction they're on, where do they wind up? In a jail cell. Even still, it's going to be cheaper if you give them this in the front end. Even if they fail 2 months later, that's still 2 months where you're paying less for this to supervise this offender than putting them in a prison cell. So it's not going to reduce the cost completely, because we're going to see in a minute, a lot of these offenders fail and will wind up back in a prison cell, but it's still cheaper in the long run, because instead of putting them straight in a jail cell, we are saving some money while we keep them in the community. All right. So let's talk about why some of these programs fail horribly. So throughout the 80s and the 90s, the federal government funded a wide range of evaluations of different correctional alternatives, all of these types that we just talked about. So there's now a huge body of research that permits us to draw some conclusions about the crime prevention effectiveness of these programs. Most of the research in the 80s and 90s was focused on the intensive supervision programs and electronic monitoring. So that's where we're going to kind of focus most of our efforts here. There are some other research on other types of programs as well, but most of the federally funded research from the 80s and 90s focused on the ISPs and electronic monitoring. So, as you might imagine, the outcome variable that they focus on the most is recidivism. That's what most people care about. The focus of most of these studies has been the recidivism rates of the offenders who are given either intensive supervision probation or routine probation. And in the majority of the cases, what we are seeing is that when we put someone on intensive supervision, probation, or parole, and compare them to people on routine probation or parole, we're either seeing no difference in the recidivism rates, or in some cases, we are seeing the ones on intensive supervision recidivating at a higher rate than those that are placed on routine probation and parole. And this is simply because of something we refer to as a supervision effect. When you watch someone more closely and thus give them more chances to fail, like we do when we use intensive supervision, probation or parole, the probability of detecting them doing crimes goes up considerably. So even if someone on routine probation and someone on intensive supervision probation are committing crimes at the same rate or failing technical violations or not doing what they're supposed to be doing at the same rate, we are going to catch the person on intensive supervision a lot more quickly than we do with someone on routine probation. So let's just use a really simple example. So say someone on routine probation has to meet with their probation officer quarterly, right? So 4 times a year. If you miss one of those meetings, that's a really big deal, right? The more meetings you miss, the more likely you are to go back to prison or to go to prison. So routine probation, we give them 4 chances to do well and also 4 chances to fail. If we are looking at someone on intensive supervision probation and they have to meet once a month, that's 12 chances that we give them to fail. So just by the sheer numbers, we are giving them more opportunities to fail. We are watching them more intensely. And it's not just the meetings. So the people on intensive supervision have a lot more conditions to follow than the people on routine probation or parole. So we are basically increasing the probability of detection, because when we use an intensive supervision program, we are increasing surveillance and control. And what we are seeing here is that does not decrease recidivism because of these supervision effects. Supervision effects basically mean that we are watching you so closely that we are increasing the probability of detecting you doing something wrong. So even if both groups of people are committing the same number of crimes, or even if someone on routine probation is, maybe let's say we're looking at quarterly drug tests compared to monthly drug tests, right? So the person on routine probation might be smoking more weed than the person on intensive, but we are going to catch the person on intensive supervision messing up because we are testing them more frequently. That is a supervision effect. It is really hard to disentangle if these programs are actually reducing recidivism or, in fact, we're just catching people more quickly. So this increased probability of detection may mean that intensive supervision offenders are at a higher risk of being caught when a criminal act is being committed compared to those on routine probation, who actually may be committing crimes more frequently. We just can't tell. That's what we know as a supervision effect. So a lot of the times when we run the statistics on this, or even just basic frequencies, like the people that are getting caught for technical violations, which means doing something that you're not supposed to do, like if you're given a list of conditions and you're either not following them. So when we run the frequencies on that, we are catching them doing more things wrong simply because we give them more to do. We are increasing the probability of detection. We are increasing the surveillance and the control of these offenders. So it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges, right? We can't compare 2 random drug tests in a year to a random drug test every month. We are always going to catch the person getting monthly random drug tests more quickly, even if the other person is doing more drugs. So that's one of the biggest problems with evaluating the effectiveness of these programs. Even if they are making a difference, it looks like they're making them worse because of supervision effects. We are watching them so closely, we're catching them more quickly. And when we catch you more quickly, you're going back to prison more quickly. So those cost savings are going down the toilet. So we all understand a supervision effect, right? We got that? Okay, very good. Let's talk about more problems with these. So like Juan was just asking, there is absolutely no consistency in the design and the implementation of these programs, even within the state. Even some judges are doing it differently. We'll talk about that on a next slide. So basically, we don't see any consistency with the surveillance and monitoring practices. So maybe let's say intensive supervision in Charleston requires random drug tests every month. In Columbia, it might be 4 random drug tests a year, right? Like there's no consistency in how we're watching these people. There's no consistency with intensive supervision for how many times you're required to meet with your officer. We don't even see any consistency in the type of intensive supervision that is offered. Some states allow different levels of intensive supervision, other states don't. Our state offers 4 levels of intensive supervision program, and the top level is specifically for sex offenders. That's just our state. Other states do it differently. We also see differences in caseloads. So the number of offenders that these officers are required to watch. So generally, on average, a routine probation officer is responsible for 70 offenders. When it's intensive supervision, we like to try to keep it between 15 and 35. But there's a really big difference between watching 15 offenders versus 35 offenders, especially when you're giving them so many conditions to follow. So again, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. Say in Charleston County, all intensive supervision probation officers watch 15 people. But then if we compare that to Columbia, who has to watch 35, clearly it's going to look like Charleston is catching more people because they've got less people to watch, right? It's going to look like Charleston is failing faster, when in reality, it just has something to do with the number of people they have to watch and the number of hours they have in a day. There are differences in the rehabilitation requirements. In some jurisdictions or states, they might require drug offenders to just get drug tests. In other states, they might require treatment. Even if we look at, so say 2 states require treatment, one just might require Narcotics Anonymous meeting, another might require more intensive, group therapy with a therapist. So there is no consistency in how these programs are designed and how they're implemented, which means we can't even tell which of these programs work best for which offenders because there are so many differences nationwide in how you do this. So the solution might be, okay, well, let's just look at Charleston County, right? We can look at how well intensive supervision probation works with Charleston County. Great. That's one county. It's going to take us a really long time to get a sample size large enough. And even when we get the results, they are not generalizable because our program is so specific. So we can't say, so say it works really well here or it doesn't work. That doesn't mean it will or will not work somewhere else because their program looks so different.
So is that why like each one of these states kind of tailor it? Do they tailor it more towards success or?
Theoretically, yes. They do what they think is best for their citizens, as well as what they can do with their resources. But from a researcher standpoint, like if you ask me if intensive supervision program works, my answer is usually not, because it looks so different that when I try to compare just Charleston County to Columbia or Richland County, it's comparing apples and oranges. Charleston might be requiring random drug tests every month. Columbia might be looking at, once a week. It's all over the place. Or even just comparing, South Carolina to North Carolina, we see wide differences. Does that answer your question, Josh? Okay. So the bottom line is the public safety benefit of these programs is based on 2 types of mechanisms that actually haven't been proven. One, the deterrence value of supervision. So if we watch you more closely, does that mean you are less likely to commit more crimes, right? If we're watching you more closely, we're catching you doing more crimes. So we would think that it works really well, but it could just be this supervision effect. It's possible that somebody we're not watching as closely is actually doing more crimes. But so we don't even know, because of the supervision effect, if we watch you more closely, if that's actually increasing public safety or not. So we don't know this deterrence value of supervision. If we watch you more closely, that doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to be committing more crimes. We're just going to catch you doing more stuff, right? That doesn't mean that you're doing more crimes than somebody that is not being watched as closely. It could honestly mean the opposite. So the next problem is the value of technical violations to prevent crime. So let me give you a really simple example. A common condition of any of these alternative sanctions is a curfew. You're not supposed to be out past 8 p.m., right? So if we catch you out past 8 p.m., were you about to rob someone, or did you get a flat tire on the way home, or did you get caught at work, right? Are we actually preventing crimes when we are giving this person technical violations? Or say you missed your treatment session. Is that because you relapsed, or because you got stuck at work, or because your kid was sick and you couldn't go, you had to stay home with your kid? There's actually no research on the value of technical violations to prevent crime. So the two things that these programs do is increase supervision and increase technical violations. And we actually don't have any research that can definitively say if that is improving public safety. Where we do have some good news finally about these programs is that when we use the power of the criminal justice system to force rehabilitation on people, that's when we actually start to see some changes. So think about it this way. If we are looking at someone on routine probation, we got two drug offenders. One's on routine probation, one's on intensive supervision probation. Routine probation is usually just 2 or 3 random drug tests a year. Intensive supervision is going to do more drug tests, but also usually require treatment. When we use the power of the criminal justice system to force someone into treatment, giving someone treatment is always going to wind up in a better result than just drug testing them, right? Drug testing them doesn't solve the problem, right? They're not actually receiving help for their problem. So when we can use these programs to give this person the treatment that they need, whether it's drug abuse treatment, alcohol treatment, mental health treatment, or education or employment training, that's when we can actually see some positive results. So it's not the increased control that's effective in reducing criminal activities, but rather the rehabilitation programs that they receive during these intermediate sanctions. And one of the things we're going to talk about next week when we talk about drug offenders is that when you force someone into treatment, it can still be effective. And the example I always get, if anybody's ever seen Intervention, these people do not want to go to treatment. They throw a fucking hissy fit. But then when you check back in with them 9 months later, they're like, oh yeah, I probably should have been doing this the whole time. I feel much better, right? So people don't usually want to go into treatment, but when you can use the criminal justice system to force them into treatment, I'm not going to say it works 100% of the time. It probably doesn't even work 50% of the time. But even if it works 40% of the time, that's 40% of the offenders that we can get off the streets, we can get clean. Drug testing someone over and over and over without treatment is not going to solve the problem. All right, let me talk about intensive supervision programs, and we'll talk a little bit about what they are and what the research says about them just a little bit more. So the concept of ISPs can be traced as far back as 1954. So specifically between 1954 and 1964, the Probation and Parole Department of California implemented a special intensive parole unit as an experiment to deal with offenders who were high risk recidivists or in need of special rehabilitation services. So this experimental unit involved reducing probation and parole officers' caseloads to a minimum of 15 and a maximum of 35. And the evaluations of this program in 1964 found that smaller caseloads accomplished very little except for greater detection of technical violations. So we knew about the existence of supervision effects in 1964. Despite that, intensive supervision programs became very popular in the 1980s when overcrowding became a really big issue. And by 1990, ISPs were found in jurisdictions in all 50 states. So even though we knew about these supervision effects, criminal justice actors at the state level implemented them anyways, mainly because they were facing such a massive problem with overcrowding. And these programs are a lot cheaper than incarcerating them. And they have the possibility of accommodating large numbers of offenders that are going into the criminal justice system or coming out. So basically, overcrowding was such an issue that they set the supervision effects aside and said, you know what, we need a different way. So even though they knew the problem with these programs, they were nationwide by the 90s, and we still see them everywhere. But when state budget and lawmakers are looking at the bottom line, these programs are a hell of a lot cheaper. And if it could potentially solve the overcrowding issue, they were willing to give it a shot. So I've kind of touched on this already, but we'll just go over it again. There are 3 ways these programs are used. No consistency in how this is done at the state level or how the judges are determining who goes where. So the front end basically means that the judge gives you intensive supervision probation right off the bat, right? So front end is always, the P stands for probation. So you're in front of the judge and he says, you know what, you have failed routine parole 4 times. This time you're going on intensive supervision parole. Or perhaps you've been in front of him several times for minor possession of marijuana. This time it's drug trafficking. So he says, that's it. We're putting you on intensive. So front end means that they give you intensive supervision probation right off the bat. Or it can be used as a probation enhancement. So say you're on routine probation and you keep getting technical violations, you're not going to treatment, you're not, meeting with your officer, you're not taking it seriously. The judge might say, okay, that's it. We're moving you up to intensive supervision, right? So perhaps you keep failing drug tests and they're saying, we can't require treatment unless we put you on intensive supervision. So we're going to do that to give you your treatment. So probation enhancement means you start with routine probation, but you keep messing up, so they move you up to intensive supervision. And the last one, the back end, that just means the P stands for parole. So that means that we are giving you intensive supervision parole instead of routine parole. So you are somebody that is too bad for regular parole, but not bad enough to stay in prison. Like you were granted parole by the state parole board or the federal parole board if it was a federal offense and you were in a federal penitentiary. But you were too high risk for us to just have you on routine parole. We're going to put you on intensive supervision parole. So front end, it's probation right off the bat. Probation enhancement, you start on routine probation and you keep messing up and they move you up to intensive supervision. Back end means you are coming out of prison and they're putting you on intensive supervision parole right away. All right, so just quickly, we're going to go over the same thing that we've discussed before, but specifically research can corroborate this. Studies have found that there have been a lot of problems with the implementation aspect of these programs. So for instance, a really famous study in the 90s showed that in 3 separate states, researchers found that intensive supervision programs were not being given to the right offenders. There was no consistency. Each judge was kind of doing their own thing. So, in one state, based on the statute, they would see that one judge was giving somebody that should be routine probation, intensive supervision probation, and somebody that was supposed to be given intensive supervision probation was being given routine probation. So it's not just that these programs look different everywhere. It's that a lot of times within each judge, they are not putting these people on these programs properly.
So do they not have really any, so they have guidelines, right? But these judges chose not to follow these guidelines. So did they increase it after that?
Either that or the guidelines are so vague that there's a little bit of a gray area and they're using that gray area to use their own judgment. So depending on a judge's personal experiences, and some judges think drugs are more of an issue. Some have a soft spot for domestic violence victims. So depending on this personal judge, they might go harsher on a specific type of offender than others, if that makes sense. And even though we switched to a more determinate sentencing model, judges still have a lot of discretion. They don't have as much discretion as they did back in the 70s, but they do still have a little bit of discretion. And sometimes this discretion can be a great thing, but a lot of times it can kind of mess with stuff. And especially as a researcher, when you're just trying to look objectively how this works, that discretion can really throw an unknown outlier into the analysis and mess the whole thing up. So it's not necessarily malicious. I think they just, have personal preferences. Everybody's a little bit different. So the last problem is the impact on recidivism. Like I was telling you before, these supervision effects, I just want to give you some numbers. So in 1993, Joan Petersilia and Susan Turner, who are just badass criminologists, these women get approved to do randomized experimental design studies like I have never seen. I do not know how they get around the ethical concerns, but let me explain the study that they did. So they used a randomized experimental design to evaluate 14 intensive supervision programs in 9 states. So they got approval in 9 states, 14 different programs. When these people went in front of judges, if they were eligible for either routine probation or intensive supervision probation, a computer randomly decided which one they got. I don't know how these women got approved for this. Mind control must be. But I mean, you could see the all kinds of ethical concerns with that, right? So anyways, they did this, and after a year, they evaluated the results, and what they found was that 37% of the intensive supervision group had been rearrested compared to 33% of those on routine probation. So we're seeing 4% percentage point increase in rearrests for the intensive supervision group. So we're seeing some supervision effects, right? Then when we look at the technical violations, that's where we really see the supervision effects. 65% of the intensive supervision offenders experienced a technical violation compared to 38% of those on the routine probation. So 65% technical violations for intensive, 38% technical violations for routine probation. And lastly, when we look at people who failed because of that and had to be recommitted or committed to prison, 27% of the intensive supervision program offenders were sent to prison because they failed, and 19% compared to 19% of those on routine probation. So we're seeing more arrests, more technical violations, and more revocations. So they're having their community status revoked and being sentenced to prison, all higher among the intensive supervision group. So we are literally seeing supervision effects. But you can really tell when you look at those technical violations, 65% compared to 38, that is a supervision effect right there. All right, so on Wednesday, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about electronic monitoring, and then we're going to sort of switch gears and we're going to talk about the problem-solving justice movement, which is kind of the new hot thing in corrections. Instead of focusing on these intensive supervision programs, a lot of states are starting to focus on courts set up specifically for specific types of offenders that are very rehabilitation heavy. So we're going to talk about 2 of them. We're going to talk about a veterans treatment court and a prostitution court. And this week, you guys are supposed to be reading an article about a human trafficking court. So we'll talk a little bit about that on Wednesday as well. So make sure you've read that reading. I think it's like Luminaris and Colleagues 2019. It's available on this week's module. So make sure you scan through that to learn about the human trafficking court. But we're going to talk about that in the veterans treatment court, prostitution court, and electronic monitoring on Wednesday. We will also go over who's playing Jeopardy the following Monday. I'll remind everybody about their quiz. Okay? Questions for me? No questions? All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.